Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of an unexpected podcast. And today I am joined by my co hosts, Matt Iverson and Evan Iverson. And today we're actually going to be doing our usual list review where you submit lists on the YouTube channel and you will review them for you from a competitive standpoint. But of course, you can bring any list you would like and we'll tell you how to make it better, how to make it efficient. We're going to be going over a Bjorning list today, and then the rest of the episode is going to be focused on the new rule book that has been put out, which I say new rule book because there are actually some slight modifications and tweaks from the FAQs that have been inserted into the new Battle of Osgiliath box set. So we're going to be going over that and talking about the box set itself as well. So without further ado, Evan, what list do we have for today?
All right. So just gonna share my screen real quick. And I am not allowed to share my screen.
Hang on.
You've not given me permission. Welcome to
all
the
right. You have
classic
permission.
quality of an unexpected podcast.
Hey, we're all professionals here. You have permission.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. You have my permission to share your screen. Go ahead.
Thank you. All right. So this list is from Jordan Y, and it's slightly more of a question than a list, but we will discuss all of the aspects of it. And his question is, what points level do you think suits the Bjorning's Legendary Legion best and why? And he said he likes 500 because you can take Grim Bjorn plus 10 Bjornings and 5 Bjornings with Great Bow. And then he says, as a secondary question or possible episode topic, are there any Legendary Legion specific rules you believe should be built into some profiles naturally? EX Bjorn getting monstrous charge. And he gives some other examples as well, like Theodred giving Riders of Theoden, Gandalf the White getting the Shade effect. Oh boy. And love the podcast and love to hear your thoughts. All right, so let's start with the Bjornings question first off. And I'd say that I would personally disagree with 500 points because I feel like the Bjornings list really becomes powerful when you're able to take 2 bears. And taking 2 bears at 500 gives you Bjorn, Grim Bjorn, and 5 Bjornings. Which just isn't what you want with numbers because you can just go and kill the Bjornings and then break them, and then it's all over. So I'd say personally for me, if I were going to take the Bjornings, I would take them at like 600 plus probably, because that gives you Bjorn, Grim Bjorn plus at least 10 Bjornings. I think either 650 or 700 is the sweet spot because you can fill up on Bjornings without getting too high a points level, where your opponents start being able to take models that can shut down your Bjornings better. And that should give you around Grim Bjorn and Bjorn plus around like 13, 15 Bjornings, something like that. And I think that's a solid number of Bjornings to have, whilst also having critically the 2 bears.
You know, I'd like to actually offer a challenge to that whole 500 point list. So you mentioned you'll get 5 Bjornings. What if you actually just go ahead and reduce it down to 2 Bjornings? And so you take both bears, 2 Bjornings. I believe, if and correct me if I'm wrong, to break me, you'd actually have to kill a bear in that format. So I'm kind of like wondering at 500 points, what can take on 2 bears? I mean, it would be a grind for sure, but you're not getting a lot of 500 points to try to contest these things.
So Devin's proposal is the classic points level of 440 and taking 440 at 500, which I think is actually, I think a better list than taking Grim Bjorn plus 5, Grim Bjorn and Bjorn plus 5 Bjornings, or taking Grim Bjorn plus 15 Bjornings.
Well, so I've got a third option, and this probably would be best used in situations where you have a lot of terrain on the table and also where you had like a scenario veto system. But if you took Bjorn, Grim Bjorn, and 5 Bjornings, and then just hid all 5 Bjornings someplace, perhaps in like 5 different places, somewhere on the board. I'm wondering how that would work. I the problem would be in like a Maelstrom scenario where you have to bring on like your Bjorning someplace where they could get ambushed by somebody. So maybe that would be a better list in the context of a tournament where you knew the scenarios. But I think in most scenarios, if you have a decent amount of terrain on the table, you can just take your 5 Bjornings and just hide them at the back of the board, send the bears forward, in the woods somewhere, send the bears forward and do battle. Because 5 Bjornings is enough where, it's not like he's going to send a couple cavalry figures to deal with them toward the back of the board. But anyway, that's my thought here.
I think we are in agreement, though, it seems, that taking just one bear probably isn't the way to go for this list at 500.
Yeah, that seems to be at least the general consensus on it.
Yeah, although I'd want to check this out. I assume you can't take Bjorn, right? The Legendary Legion requires you to take Grim Bjorn. Is that why this is Grim Bjorn?
You must take. Well, actually, no. You know what? I don't know.
I'm going to check that. I'll be right back. You guys can go ahead and fill the air.
Honestly, no, I don't think it'll be competitive to the point where it'll win a tournament. But I would be very interested in taking 2 bears to a 500-point tournament. And
so actually, there is no requirement to take Grimbeorn.
Yeah.
So you take one. But I mean, why would you want to take
the only rule is that if the Beorning's force includes both Beorn and Grimbeorn, Beorn will automatically be the leader.
Yeah.
I mean, but I wouldn't want Beorn anyway, since
he runs after stuff. Yeah, no, that's probably right. He's a little tougher, but I think you're right about that.
I think at 500, the difference between fight 7 and fight 8 isn't gonna really matter that much.
Yeah. Yeah, probably right. Yeah, I mean, so the problem, there's 2 problems with the one bear solution. Yeah, first of all, obviously that's a huge hit. That's a huge loss to your hitting power and only taking 1 bear, because you basically got only 1 threat on the table. The other thing is it halves the might this army that really has a really small level of might actually can bring to bear. No pun intended. And taking an army even at 500 points that just has 3 might is a problem.
Especially when he's going to need it to protect himself.
Exactly.
Your army is never going to move first. So you really have to rely on your opponent not having the resources to be able to take out your Beornings. Like if this army goes up against like a fight 6 hero on a horse, then it's just going to get run over because Grimbeorn is going to get pinned down by all of their chaff guys, and then that fight 6 hero is going to walk through 2-4 Beornings a turn and sort of just wipe out the army while Grimbeorn doesn't do much. Versus when you have the 2 threats of bears, it sort of forces you to deal with the bears in some respect. And
by the way, for a 400-point tournament, though, this is great. This is a great Legendary Legion.
Yeah, that'd be so gross. It would keep on objective-based games, though. It'll be tough because you literally can't capture. Like,
well, you do. You just devour the other guy's entire army, and then
you auto win if you table them, so you're good.
That's right.
Also, one note on the double bear thing is they also help each other out. I mean, if you manage to hurl one bear's combat, the models in one bear's combat into the other combat, they can then protect each other. So if someone's calling a heroic strike and you just don't want to try to challenge that to burn your own might, just knock the combat down.
Right.
Heroic combat.
Yeah, it is fun when the 2 bears start to play catch with the other guy's figures with hurls. Yeah. So what it's making me think about now is, if I recall correctly, the Chaos and Arda game at Ardacon is a 400-point list. So I can only imagine how many Grimbeorn, Bjorn, Legendary Legion combinations are going to be showing up at Chaos and Arda at Ardacon next year. I can imagine sitting down at a table and going, here's my 2 bears, and looking around, and everybody else is like, yeah, and here's my 2 bears. Here's my 2 bears. Here's my 2 bears. So, uh, so another question here is, at what points level does it become too much, right? Because that's the problem with this list is, it's almost like a sine curve where if it's too small, if it's too small, you get the 2 bears and not enough guys. So you can, get broken easily, don't have enough combat power. Then there's an ideal peak somewhere where it's like 2 bears and just enough guys. But then you reach a point of diminishing returns, because after a certain point, you're not getting any more bears out of the list. You're just getting more Bjornings, and the folks you are fighting are getting more and more hard-hitting heroes in with their list. So it's not clear to me that you want to be taking this legendary legion for things that are much more than 800 points. It clearly works at 800 points because people have been successful with it. But I'm not sure how much above 800 points this is really viable. I'm not.
First and foremost, please never mention a sine curve again, ever. As a math student, that's making me relive some trauma.
I was going to say, are you having flashbacks right now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's serious PTSD right now. And second off, well, I mean, the maximum you can possibly take this list is at 1,000 points, because that's Bayor and
Then you run out of
15,
slots.
15.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then after that you run out of slots. But I think 800 is definitely like sort of pushing the edge of where Beornings are viable and where they're not viable. Because you start getting into like, you get a lot of Beornings and you've got the 2 bears, and then your opponents are starting to be able to take like those wizards and those casters and those big heroes that can beat the bears. So I'd say I agree that I definitely wouldn't take them above 800 if you're trying to like do well at a tournament. I would even question whether or not you want to take them at something like 750 or 800, because even that to me seemed a little high.
So is the sweet spot then? Well, let's see. Is the sweet spot then 700? So the 2 bears and 15 Bjornings.
That's what it feels like to me.
Yep.
Okay. I have never fought against or played with these bears, so I will concede to your guys' guess. So.
You're just going to grin and bear it.
I'm just going to agree that things. But we do actually have a second question on this topic as well, or actually kind of not even this topic, but he was asking if some of the Legendary Legion rules should be built into the profiles naturally. Now, some of the examples, I actually think they will be built in naturally over time. This is just a guess, of course. But Baron getting monstrous charge all the time, I actually think that this Legion corrects an error in the profile of Bayorn. And I think even the Middle Earth team can't deny that Bayorn is never played outside of this Legion. And just the fact that they gave that bonus to Gullivar is kind of, to me, indicative of that they notice monstrous charge is kind of necessary for most of these big creatures. I wouldn't doubt that monstrous charge might in future editions even be kind of distributed to more things than we even expect to make, like, I'm not saying like this is going to happen, like mountain trolls, like more competitive or whatnot. I mean, all of those units become more competitive if they have monstrous charge, which I know sounds nuts that they should even have that, but I'm like, even if it's just walking, that thing is really big and should probably have monstrous charge. So I think monstrous charge is almost a rule that should be given to all monsters, but I digress. I'm sure maybe for competitive reasons that won't happen. Now, my opinion on Theodred granting riders with Theoden and Gandalf the White getting the shade effect, no, that's probably not going to happen. And I think these legions get those type of rules mainly because they would be worried about some of the comboing effects that could happen outside of these legions. I'm mainly looking at the shade effect, which as you can tell from the actual shade, they keep nerfing into oblivion.
Yeah, but if I recall, Gandalf can only.
Gandalf's is a one-time thing.
It's a one-time shot.
But even
Yeah.
then, it would still be quite a huge buff. I was actually looking at the Theodred Riders of Theoden rule, because if he were to get that, I don't think I would ever take Theoden ever in any of my lists, because just point for point, Theodred is a much better combat hero, and him also providing that special rule.
What is his
I
special
think,
rule again?
Well, I just meant, so
The Riders of
his
Theoden?
special rule,
He counts as
he's got the reckless charge thing.
Well, no.
But
I
for
mean, what is
Riders of
the
Theoden,
granting?
it's the +1 fight value.
Right.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
for
Then
the
there's no
Riders of
reason to
Rohan.
take Theoden at that point. You're right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the Gandalf the White one is, because I do think Gandalf the White needs something else to justify his points for bringing him, because I mean, we've talked about Gandalf the White a lot, and I think the general consensus is, yeah, he's great, but he's not as great as his points warrant, which is why you rarely see him in lists. I'm not sure that the getting the one-time shade effect would be a bad thing for him. The change that's kind of hanging out there for Gandalf the White, that's like all done except for writing the rule, is his ability to carry a hobbit as a passenger, which could be used to give him somewhat of a buff in the same way that it does Durnhelm. Yeah. So I think that's more of an obvious way to go if you're looking to buff up Gandalf the White. But yeah, I mean, with that being said, I think what this question is getting at is, are there circumstances where a legendary legion has been created to kind of paper over a problem with a figure, like Bjorn and the monstrous charge? I think that has happened on a number of occasions, and who knows what will happen. Who knows, first of all, if there's going to be a new edition of the army lists. I suspect that there will at this point, because they're now, with the introduction of the new book, as we'll talk about in a minute, they've all kind of become antiquated because they still require you to use FAQs. So I expect we'll get a new set of books at some point, and I would expect certain figures to get fixed as they did the last time around, and maybe some of the issues from the legendary legions will be brought in to fix them.
Yeah, I think that's sort of my hope as well, is that instead of putting these things and using these legendary legions as band-aid solutions to make an unviable army viable, why not just
Make the
apply
army
those
viable.
changes in game and make the army viable in the first place, and make people want to take it without having to memorize this whole separate, different army. And so that takes sort of the burden off people having to know every single legendary legion, of which there are how many now? Like 30?
Yeah,
It feels like
They are legion.
way too many.
Well, I mean, a lot of the legions also seem to be this like how they wanted to make the army, but they didn't have the figures at the time. So like ruffians and the dead men of Dunharrow, both of those are like, they have like rules that allow them to make unlimited war bands and all that kind of nonsense, but clearly it was just during a time where they didn't really have the units to deal with that, like the heralds and the ruffian leaders and such. So some of them actually are a rewrite of the original army in a sense. And then some of these changes, I think, like for some of these legions, I don't think they wanted to make it viable. They actually genuinely just wanted a different version of the list. So like Rohan using spear supports, I think that they never intend to give Rohan the ability to spear support. I think that's just like mechanic of the way they play that they like. And so,
but don't like it enough to take it out of all the various legendary legions that they granted it to. that puzzles me. I don't know why
Hmm.
that is.
Yeah, I could agree with that. It is kind of puzzling. Like it is, what is wrong with making a Foot
Yeah.
Rohan army?
I mean, if they had done like one legendary legion where you could do that, and they said, well, this represents a particular circumstance here, but now they've done it in what, 3-4 legendary legions.
Yeah.
And
It's not like if Foot Rohan, like outside of legendary legions, had this ability, it would be so much stronger than any of these
right,
legendary
yeah,
legions.
exactly.
Because you can take all of the heroes sort of in one of the 3 legendary legions. Like all of the Rohan heroes fit in there. So I think sort of restricting that to an army bonus, so you can't just like ally them around or anything like that. And it'll have basically the same effect.
Keep in mind, to the person asking this question, one of the things that they're trying to do is actually give people these special rules and such to reward you for playing these thematic armies. That's kind of the entire reason that legendary legions got created. So if they insert these rules back into the normal profiles, then the rewards go away and you suddenly can just do the combo shenanigans that many editions, pretty much almost every edition up until this point, has been doing. And you could see this edition is a hard, like they're trying to really push hard against, with the alliance matrix and the illegality of certain, even having anyone with like Errol the Young, for example. You know, I think the legendary legions, they don't want those, a lot of these effects, like Gandalf the White getting the shade effect, or Riders of Theoden rule. So that's another consideration on why that probably won't happen. But
There's
then, yeah,
there's got to be a more elegant way to do that, though, than basically have this complicated system of carrots and sticks to
yeah.
to make people put together quote historical unquote lists.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's a much more elegant. If you think about this game actually in its history, Adam Troke had to write this game by himself for the Hobbit edition. So, like, he didn't even really have a chance to work with many other minds that might have made the edition more elegant. And then Jay, this is his first game he's ever written. So, or from my understanding, I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it was his first game he was ever written. So, in the hands of someone who maybe like a 30-year vet in writing game systems, yeah, I'm sure a more elegant solution could have been made. So
And maybe they'll end up doing that the next time. I mean,
that person
there's
would be probably too expensive.
What?
A 30-year vet who's written lots of game systems.
No, but I mean, the people who have been writing this game system have now been writing this game system for a long time, or at least a longer time. So, so maybe because I mean, there are a number of different solutions you could do to make this better. I mean, you could put all these, rules in, and then just, kind of just limit what can ally in with certain other things. I mean, one thing you could do if, you're trying to, if you're trying to like decrease, random hodgepodges of lists, is you just tax it, right? Where you say, for each allied contingent, that's in your rules, you have to buy it, right, for a certain amount of points. And whatever that that point tax is going to be, 20, 30, 40 points or something like that. So
that'd be interesting. Almost like kind of Warhammer 40K almost does that, but with equipment.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting if you could just simply upgrade them with like points. I mean, there'd be an argument to why that character doesn't have it all the time, but it would definitely be interesting.
Well, I mean, what I was thinking was, for each allied contingent you bring, it costs you X points.
Oh, you mean like that? Okay.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. So,
well, maybe a topic for another podcast for sure, because that seems like it definitely has a lot of legs as a conversation.
Yeah, it does. It could, I mean, you could even vary it depending on, like, Perhaps a green ally costs you 10 points to bring in, a yellow ally costs you 30 points to bring in, and a red ally costs you 50 points to bring in, or something like that. So, that's one of those iron rules of economics, right? I mean, if you want less of something, tax it. And it's a simple way to do it without kind of crafting all these complicated, special rules and stuff like that only apply in certain circumstances.
I think it's a great idea. So I think, definitely maybe a podcast episode. If you guys are interested in hearing that, I'll comment on the YouTube channel, and we can definitely talk about that subject. But for the sake of time, we're actually going to go into the rules manual.
Also, really quick,
sure.
Before we go into the rules manual, just a call as a reminder to if you have any lists that you're interested in trying out or taking to a tournament, or just even throwing around in the idea bin, send them to us, comment them. You can post them on our Facebook page as well, and we'll review them.
And by the way, if in the past you have submitted a list and we did not choose it to talk about, the odds are that the reason we did that was not because we didn't like it or we don't want to talk about it or whatever. It's probably more likely that, I mean, we only have one slot to talk about these. We can't talk about all the lists. So if you still want us to consider that list or talk about it, or it's still relevant to you, go ahead and resubmit it and put it back up, because we only look at the previous episodes lists in general. We don't go back to like our historical backlog. So if there's one that you still want us to talk about, submit it again and just put it up there and we'll take a look at it, and maybe we'll do it the second time.
All right. So the Battle of Osgiliath box set, Matt, you've noticed, unless this is not the first part of it you want to jump into, but from my understanding, you've noticed that they've inserted the FAQs into the book. However, they've slightly modified the way they've done that, or the words that they've used, which kind of changes the rule. So go ahead and walk us through some of that.
All right, so I will start. Well, first of all, here's the Osgiliath box set for. Well, no, there's no way I'm getting this on the screen. Never mind. There's a large box. It's an Osgiliath box set. You've all seen pictures of it. You don't need to see pictures of it here. We'll talk through what the rest of the components are in a second. But obviously, the most important set, or the most important component from a competitive point of view, is the new rule set, which, by the way, does. Let me see if I can get this in front of the screen here. It does look different. So this is, if you recall, the rule set before had Gandalf the White on the cover. This does not. This has the Eye of Sauron. So you can tell this book from the previous book, which I think is essential because a lot of the changes in here are subtle. But they have, as advertised, incorporated the FAQs into the rule book. They have, in general, done that in ways that are just insertions of the actual FAQs. So, for example, they'll have like on page 25 in the discussion of moving models, they have insertion of models may only move off the board in scenarios that specifically allow it, or if they have a special rule that permits them to do so. Models may only ever move off the board voluntarily, may not be forced off the board by effect of an enemy model, such as a command, compel, magical power. Models cannot back away off the board. That's just a compilation of the various rules that have been put in. I went to try and figure out whether... I started reading through the rule book to try and figure out whether there was anything new in here, the way they were incorporated. I have not completed this process. It's a long process, but there are some changes here that are at least different from the FAQs, or subtly change the way the rules have been interpreted. And I'll give one example here. This is in the rules of resisting a magical power. They have inserted the section, if a magical power specifically states it affects part of a model, such as one that states that if the target is a cavalry model, then the caster must choose which part of the model is affected. then only this part of the model may attempt to resist the magical power if able. So this is new verbiage that kind of consolidates some of the FAQs that we've seen in various other sections, like the way it treats Gandalf the White. This was a concept that everybody had kind of extrapolated from the FAQs that dealt with Gandalf the White and how he dealt with Shadowfax. And it's contrary to some of the other verbiage in the rules, which I think is actually still there, which makes things, there's a little tension in the rules. But the rules do now explicitly state that when a spell targets a horse, only the horse can resist. And so that's a new section. Another new interesting section.
Which there's only one spell in the game that targets models.
There's more than one.
Yeah, there's more than one.
Yeah. I can, while Dad's looking at those other things, I can look in the rules and see which one specifically.
There is a second change that's in here. That has to do with siege engines. When you get to the section on firing a siege engine, this is on page 118 of the new rules. It has a whole bunch of sections about, it has all the sections about hitting with a siege engine. And then when you get to the bottom, it says, note, if a model involved in a fight is hit by a siege engine shot, then determine which model in the fight is hit by the initial shot in the same way as a normal shooting attack. So this is different not only from the original rule set, because the original rule set said that everybody in the fight was hit by the initial shot if the initial shot hit that. It is also different from the FAQ, because the FAQ said that basically the way the FAQ worked out was, and I went back and I double checked this is consistent with the FAQ, said everybody who was in the fight got knocked down, but it was the auto kill that only hit the figure that was originally hit. So like if you had, say, if you had like a strength 9 siege engine that was shot into combat, everybody in the combat would be knocked down. Everybody in the combat would take a strength 9 hit, but only the target that was actually hit on the roll off, the good evil roll off, only they would automatically die if they took a wound from the hit. This is different from that. This says that basically you just treat it as a normal shot. The stone is just going to fall on one of the two people that are fighting. The other guy is going to be fine, unless there's some sort of blast effect, in which case presumably the guy is still going to be in the blast effect. But if you shoot like the Isengard assault ballista into a combat and you hit your own guy, it's your own guy that's going to take the strength 9 hit and be blown back further. It's the other guy is just going to be standing there going, what happened to my opponent? So I don't know how many of these things that there are throughout the rules. Like I said, I haven't gone through them all, but they're definitely in here.
So just to interject really quickly, there are 6 magical powers where you can specify whether you're targeting the model on top or the model on the bottom. Some of them don't matter at all, really. Some of them do. They are Banishment, Black Dart, Chill Soul, Curse, Drain Courage, and the final one is Wither. So those are your spells where you can pick which one.
3 of those actually matter. So yeah.
Curse is absolutely not going to matter. Banishment.
If you wanted to take away
the game, that matters.
If you wanted to take away Shadowfax's fate points, you could curse him.
I mean, if that's your
Not-
only spell.
I'm not suggesting that as a tactic.
I
but
mean,
you do.
the only model with curse is the
The
necromancer, and I have a feeling you would prefer to chill soul
Yeah.
artifacts instead, but you could do that if you wanted to.
Yep. So in other places, they have done, I think, a good job of incorporating a whole bunch of FAQs into the rules. Like if you look at the rules for the ring, and the rules for Shroud of Shadows that appeared on page 103 of the new rules, they have expanded the verbiage significantly to put in a whole bunch of FAQs on how invisibility works, and I think that's great. It's good to have all of that stuff in one place. I have gone through and I have kind of cross-checked the FAQs against those rules that were added, and they all seem to be basically they took the FAQ and they just kind of layered it onto the original rule. So I don't think there's any changes there, but there are, like I said, there are at least 2 changes in these rules, and I have read nowhere near the entire rule, so I'm sure that there are more. And I don't think they're bad changes, by the way. I think they make things a lot cleaner than they were before. But I'm not 100% sure that you want to go into a tournament armed with the old version of the book. And I'm curious to see, I haven't looked, but I'm curious to see if there's going to be an edition of this new rule set that comes out and people can purchase.
Yeah, I mean, at this point,
so.
Yeah, even I don't think any tournament organizer especially should ever have the old book. They just might as well just get the new one.
Well,
I think ideally what they're going to do is they're just going to online just replace both versions of this book, both the electronic version and the normal version, with this book, because I mean the previous edition of this book is now pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because it's been replaced. The new rules are.
I'm pretty confident you can't even buy them as of right now. So
So I'm 90% sure that that's what they'll do. They'll replace both versions, hopefully at least.
Yeah. So on that note, as far as tournament organizers go, there is a very interesting, entirely new section added to the rules. And this is on page 15. And this is the code of conduct, which, before that we had the most, this comes right after the most important rule, which is, have fun. After that, we have a code of conduct, which, it doesn't specify what the consequences are for breaking the code of conduct. But given that it's put forward as a code, one would expect that there would be some consequences. And I'm kind of curious to see what impact, if any, this is going to have on tournaments in the game. So, the code of conduct starts off with cardinal rules. The first is always be polite and respectful to your opponent at all times, which we can agree is a cardinal rule, and always tell the truth and never cheat, which I think we can also all agree is a cardinal rule. And then it goes to lay out, let's see, how many do they have here? 16 important principles.
Wow. Okay.
And starting off with make a respectful gesture to your opponent before the game begins, such as wishing them good luck, offering a handshake. When I mentioned this to Evan, he immediately gave me the finger. I don't think that actually counts as a respectful gesture.
Depends on what country you're in, I think.
Yeah, it could be.
In America, it does, yeah.
And then we've got some, fairly obvious but innocuous ones, like avoid using language that your opponent or those around you might find offensive, and arrive on time for your game with all of the things you need to play. And then there are some. Then they get into ones that are almost like a checklist, right? Ask your opponent's permission if you want to use any unpainted or substitute models during your game. Offer your opponent the chance to examine your army roster before the game begins. If your opponent has any questions or queries about your army list, answer them truthfully and ensure your opponent understands the answer. discuss the terrain before the game begins. That's definitely something that should be on the checklist.
Yeah, that was usual.
Measure moves and distances carefully and accurately. And this is always kind of one of my pet peeves that people do. Allow your opponent the opportunity to check any distances before you move any models if they wish. So, don't just kind of like put the ruler down and then immediately like move the figure over, so that, if it's a contentious or close thing, so that, basically, if somebody thinks, well, wait a minute, I thought that was outside of 6 inches. You've now prevented it from ever being checked by just instantly moving your figure over. When rolling dice, make sure they're clearly visual to your opponent, and allow your opponent to examine the rolls before picking up the dice. Always ask your opponent's permission before touching their models. That's kind of a less important one. Right. This is another key one here. Remind your opponent about any rules they may have forgotten to use or that they have used incorrectly, especially when doing so is to your opponent's benefit rather than your own. I think that is something we should all take to heart. Look, we all forget rules, and sometimes we are aware that opponents are forgetting rules. And so this has now been codified in the book, that you now have an obligation to remind your opponent if he has screwed something up, or, for example,
I'm
forgotten his
interested
banner.
to see how many people will actually follow this
Me
particular line of
too.
advice.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe in a fun tournament.
So
it's very easy to just say, "Oh, I forgot too." I mean,
we'll talk about that when we get to the end. Never deliberately manipulate the amount of time a game takes in order to gain an advantage, either by playing overly quickly or by wasting time. Interesting one there. Try not to distract an opponent when they are trying to concentrate, and always ensure you respect their personal space. We've noted that there are some people who don't do that. Another pet peeve of mine, although it doesn't impact gameplay: never complain about your own bad luck or your opponent's good luck. So this is okay to a point. I mean, we all have bad rolls, and we can all, we understand chance is part of this game, and we can,
yeah, that shouldn't be a code of conduct thing. Because
this is, I think, what this is getting at, right? So there's a difference between, oh my God, I just rolled all ones with Aragorn, and then, everybody has a good laugh about it, as opposed to, I never had a chance in this game because my dice were so bad.
Yeah.
So that's the type of thing this, I think, is directed.
You're never going to get rid of that. And let's just say, I'm such a big opponent of blaming dice for losing matches, but it's so difficult to blame yourself and to blame your own strategy, play style, tactics in the game. It's very difficult for a lot of people to do that because it's a huge blow to ego. And that's just kind of like how people are kind of built. So that's a pretty hard one.
Welcome to human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well,
the issue with this is that when you complain about things, sure, it makes you yourself, at least you feel like you're making yourself feel better. Are you actually making yourself feel better? Probably not. But the issue is, it is destructive, one, to your opponent, because it makes them feel invalidated, because they feel like, oh, they played their best, and now you're saying that they didn't actually win because of skill, they won because you rolled bad. And two, it just brings down the entire atmosphere of either the game day or the tournament or whatever you're doing. Just having someone complaining about like dice and luck and talking about, oh, how this is such a stupid game, I roll so poorly, why is this so dice based? Those sorts of things just really bring down the environment and make everyone have less fun.
Yeah, that is true. And like I was saying earlier, there's a difference between talking about one bad roll on which the game turned, which happens, and then the people that you play that claim that the laws of probability don't apply to them, and that they're cursed by the gods, and otherwise their superior skill would have caused them to beat you every time.
I think what's even worse is when they're saying that you're winning because you're just rolling lucky. Like, not even that they're rolling unlucky, that they're
Yep.
saying the laws of probability do not apply to you, which can sometimes even have the connotation that maybe your dice are loaded or something like that, or like you're not playing fair or anything like that,
Yep.
which is also really problematic.
Yep.
Yeah.
And all right, so then the last two are always be humble in victory, graceful in defeat. Always good advice.
That one's gonna be hard for me. I'm not. No. No.
Why? Because you can't win.
Especially,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. Exactly.
You have no opportunity to be humble.
I've never had a chance to be humble.
Yeah, that's right.
Though to be fair, that doesn't eliminate the fact that he's never been graceful in defeat. So
Fair enough. Yeah, that's right. Well, he would be humble if the dice would ever roll well enough to allow him to win.
Exactly. I keep telling people that.
And then the last one is never fix the outcome of a game for any reason, which seems to be a good code of conduct. The question that's raised by all of this, and it's not answered by the rules, is what consequences are there for failing to adhere to the code of conduct?
I mean, that's going to be a judge thing. It's the tournament TO who has to decide that. Because if you can't put consequences in a book where you have strict rules, it's kind of like almost like laws, I imagine. It's like, oh, the penalty for stealing is $500 to 10 years in prison. Like, it's, because it's like it depends on the circumstance and all that stuff. So it's like it almost doesn't even mean anything to even put a consequence in there. Because, I think it really just depends on what is going on, why. Because then even if you put consequences that theoretically a TO has to strictly follow, now players can try to hold them to that. And they can be like, well, my opponent did this, so you should be kicking them out, or you should be docking them points, or you should be doing this. And now the TO is fighting against a rule book when the situation clearly calls for probably a different approach. And so I'm actually glad they didn't put consequences in there, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I wonder if this is going to evolve into something, because most codes of conduct have consequences for breaking them. That is kind of what codes of conduct are all about. I'm
not saying there's no consequences, but I'm just saying,
look,
they didn't force me to make a decision.
Yeah, there's no consequences as written. What I'm wondering about is, like I said, how these will evolve.
Well, so you can just simply say now in a TO packet, violations of the code of conduct and the rules manual now equate to these consequences. So I don't mind the flexibility they've given me. In fact, the fact that they even wrote the codes of conduct is kind of interesting. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure anyone who normally breaks these codes of conduct aren't going to suddenly start following them because they were like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to not manipulate time. Like,
so that raises another question, which is calling out an opponent when he violates one.
Well, that's a personality thing. I mean,
yeah, it is.
That's yeah. That'd be really hard.
It's also difficult to do, especially with like slow play and stuff like that, because I mean, I've seen accusations of slow play being flung around. Like, I felt like someone slow playing me before. I've had people feel like I was slow playing them before. And like, usually it's not that cut and dry. Usually it's like they're just thinking very hard about what they feel to be very important. And then like when someone calls it out, there's a whole fight and an argument, and then it really sours the game. And then it ends up being like, no consequences happen to that person who is supposedly violating the rule because there's no real way to prove it.
Yeah, for some of these that's true. For some of these it's not. For example, allow your opponent the opportunity to check any distances before you move any models, right? So the problem with this has always been, I hurriedly move, your opponent or I hurriedly move the figure, and then all of a sudden the questionable move distance was in range and was not. if somebody does that now, and I have not had an opportunity to check, does that shift the presumption of whether or not the model was in range or not? Because if somebody goes ahead and does that, before it was always like, well, we can't fix it now, so I guess I'm in range. And now I wonder if the answer is, sorry, the code of conduct required you to give me the
I
opportunity to
feel
verify
like
that was in range.
people could be very vicious with that. Like if even if you're making like an obvious move to charge into someone, because like you can't wait after every single model you move and go, okay, opponent, go ahead. Do you want to check this? They're like, no, okay, you move the model. You can't do that. So like even if you're making like something that's like maybe 5.5 inches away, you move your warrior 5.5 inches to charge into the fell beast. It looks like a super obvious move, so you do it, and then your opponent goes, "No, I didn't check that. You're out of range. He can't charge." And I mean, there's not much you can do about that. And I think that's sort of the issue with that is just
Yeah.
being able to call someone on that like whenever seems
I
a
think
little
Evan's
too
completely
much.
right about that. No, I agree 100%. And I almost say it would be flipped where, the way I've always said the players should do it is when you move a model, state your intention to be in or out of charge range. Like once the intention is stated, then it is. So whenever an opponent says, yeah, they're keeping me, they're trying to be 7 or 6.5 inches away, and then somehow later on we measure it and they're 6, it's like, no, you stated the intention was to be 6.5, push them back a half inch. Like, it's just like, I mean, I almost feel like that's a more effective solution than.
Oh, yeah, it certainly is. But remember, there are going to be some circumstance. Well, first of all, sometimes you don't notice it, and sometimes you end up with a player who is stretching that ruler a bit. But
Yeah.
sometimes there are going to be circumstances where you're not going to have the opportunity to do that, right? Because sometimes the other guy is going to move second in a turn and then move first in the next turn. So it wasn't you that kind of got the model within charge range; it was them. And I almost wonder whether this is something where you have to consciously turn it on with an opponent. Like if you're playing against somebody who you think has been cheesing the charge distances, the first time it happens, you say, look, you're required to give me an opportunity to verify that you are in range, at least in questionable circumstances. You didn't do that here. That's fine. We'll see who was in range. But going forward, if make sure that I'm verifying that you are within range when you charge. And maybe you only turn that on if you're in a game where you're realizing that's being abused. But I think that is something that you can do now. It is fully within your rights because this is in the rules, right? And that's something to do. Plus, it is also clear that if somebody's whining at you about bad dice, that maybe you want to correct them on that. But I guess that's a personal preference about whether you want to insert angst into the game to
yeah, if someone's
do that or not.
blaming dice and you correct them on that, you're inviting tension.
Yeah,
at that
you
point,
are.
because it's just as Evan said, they're doing it to make themselves feel better. That's why they're blaming the dice. And so if you shift that back onto their ego, which is already clearly fragile if they're blaming dice, then I mean, you could have a guy flip a table. Like,
Yep.
I mean, there's a reason why people don't always tell the truth, and that's because if you tell the truth, certain truths make people feel bad. And if you tell them that like, hey, this is just you being an asshole and trying to like keep your ego intact, they are going to go nuts
Yep.
because they don't want to admit that. That's the whole point of what they're saying in the first place.
Yeah. So, all right. So in any case, I mean, I'm glad these are here. And I'm glad somebody took the time to write down all of these things that, if followed, lead to better games. if for no other reason, then there are people out there who have been justifying doing all of these things to themselves all this time because they weren't prescribed by the rules, and now they are. So it'll be interesting to see how enforcement of this code of conduct evolves over time, but I think this is definitely a step in the right direction.
So other than that, I guess all the FAQs are just in there, and it's not, or so far that you've seen, that you haven't seen a lot of other adjustments.
Yeah, well, and look, I haven't read through enough of this book to really quantify how many are in there.
Matt,
I'm going to have to do this. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to do this, and maybe this is another episode where, like, once, because I am going, and I am, see if we can show it here. I am tabbing this book, and once we kind of get through it all, maybe it will be worth going through the rule book and at least talking about the listing all the situations where we think that the rules have changed.
And for anyone who's wondering, Matt's not bored in reading a whole book all the time. He just does this for a living, so it's like super easy for him. So.
I actually have a problem with reading the book cover to cover. I'm not sure I've actually done it in the old set of rules, and I always say, all right, this time I'm going to read through the rules cover to cover, and I don't do it. This may actually force me to, because they've hidden these rule changes in the rules. So, there are Easter eggs in here. So this time I may actually do it. And every time I do it, because I'm not one of these guys who tends to like read all the rules, I tend to like pick up the rules changes by osmosis from, playing games and having other people correct me. But I have already stumbled across 3 or 4 different instances of things where it goes, oh, that's a change in the rules, and I picked up the old book and looked at it. It's like, oh no, I guess it's not. I just never knew that. It'll be an interesting exercise.
All right, well, then that's I think that pretty much concludes the episode. Anything else we want to talk about before we let everyone go?
Well, do we want to talk about what's in the box, or does everybody know that already?
I mean, we could do like a very quick, like, is it worth it sort of thing.
Yeah. So
I mean, wouldn't you have to break it down monetarily in order to even assess that?
Well,
I mean, not exactly.
Let me just go through some of the other things that are in this box. I mean, there's stuff that we all recognize. There's a sprue of new figures that has all the new I guess the 3 new poses for the various Rangers figures, and then there's the new Gothmog sprue. There's all the standard stuff that we've seen before. So there's a couple sprues of orcs, there's a sprue of Rangers, there's a sprue of Osgiliath warriors, there's a troll in here. And then, one thing that is actually really interesting are the new Osgiliath ruin sets. So these are not like the old Osgiliath ruin sets, where basically you had like a bunch of chunks that fit together. These are much more like the Dol Guldur sets, and I'm going to see if I can hold one up so people can see it here. So this is what you get. They're not like big chunks that you just glue together and they only come together one way. These are modular, and they come with a set of instructions, and these construction sets give you ways to put together 4 multi-level sections from these. But I assume at some point they're going to start selling these kits separately, and when they do, because they're modular like this, I think you can if you want to turn these into Legos and build these sets in different ways, or just build like one giant tower or something like that has multi floors, I think you can do that, and I think that's going to be neat and be fun to play with. So I'm looking forward to doing that. There's also,
from my understanding, that scenery, the only way you can get it is to buy this starter box, at least currently.
I think currently, yes.
Okay.
I suspect at some point they're going to sell it separately. because like I said, the way this stuff is designed, it seems like it's going to be something where you could buy like 4 sets of this and do Tinker Toys and like create a giant Osgiliath fortress if you wanted to, or 3 different ones or whatever. And if they don't sell it separately, that's a missed opportunity for them, because I know I would go if they sell this stuff separately. I get a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And put it together. They also have a scenario pack that has scenarios and profiles, so you can play this on your own. I haven't looked at these scenarios yet. There's not that many of them. Let's see how many. 1, 2, 3. There's only 4 scenarios in this book, which I think is fine. And I don't know, maybe at some time we'll take a look at those. And they give you some counters.
Are all the new scenarios for the 6 missions in there? There's 18 missions now, but
there's 18 missions. There's okay. So yeah, that's something that I guess is worth mentioning in the rules manual is they have, I assume to save space, cut down the number of
I assume to also incentivize buying the match play guide.
That's true, but I'm not sure having 6 less scenarios is really. I mean, already if you wanted all the scenarios that people play, you had to buy the match play guide, and that hasn't changed. It's just it's gone down from 12 in the rule book to 6 in the rule book.
That's interesting. Okay, so they just gave you enough just to play the game, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
exactly. But I think both before and after you had to have the match play guide if you were going to go and have all the scenarios you wanted for a tournament. So nothing's changed there. So all right, well that's a quick tour of the box. But like I said, I think the major takeaway from this is that the new rules manual, I think, is a must-have. And at a certain, I mean, you kind of need the box at this point to have that. I'll be interested to see when it comes out. I mean, you can get by having the old rule set in the FAQs, but there are going to be some subtle things that are going to be different. You're going to need to know what those are.
All right then. Well then, so thank you everyone for joining us. Don't forget to post a list in the comment section of the YouTube channel, and we will all see you very soon. So
bye everybody.